Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. One of my favorite things is when great artists make great songs pretty much by accident. Like during a break in the recording session for their second album, Songs from the Big Chair, Tears for Fears guitarist Roland Orzabal started messing around with a simple 2-chord vamp. It was near the end of the production process for Shout, and the rest of the album was already complete. The band just wanted to wrap things up. Orzabal had no interest in turning his little vamp into a real song, but producer Chris Hughes thought it had potential, so he pushed him to go off and write the rest of it. In his words,
Roland was really not interested. I said, you have to go away and write this song. I know it's only 2 chords, but it's really good.
He even went so far as to make them listen to it for an hour at the end of every day after they'd finished working on Shout to encourage the band to find a way to make it work. Eventually, Orzabal agreed to write the song, settling on the lyrical hook "Everybody Wants to Go to War," but again, he didn't care for it. He thought it was boring and wanted to drop the song so he could go home, but after even more encouragement from Hughes, he changed it to "Everybody Wants to Rule the World," and suddenly, everything fell into place. The entire process of writing, recording, and producing the track took just 2 weeks, extremely fast by the meticulous standards of Tears for Fears, but that loose, intuitive approach created one of their most iconic songs. Let's take it apart. The song starts like this, and you may have noticed I didn't notate it like I normally do. That's because figuring out how to notate this section correctly is actually kinda tricky. Up until last week, when I started working on this video, I had always heard the rhythm like this, with the accented B on beat 3. In 3/4 time, placing an accent on beat 3 creates a lot of momentum, pushing your ear forward to the next downbeat. That's what I thought was happening here, but I was wrong. You see, if that is the rhythm, then this transition becomes really awkward with an extra 8th note thrown in at the end for no apparent reason. I don't know, maybe there's some prog rock influence I'm missing here, but otherwise this seems pretty unlikely. If we instead just look at the last 6 notes before the transition and assume that's supposed to be a bar, we get this, with the F sharps on the beats and these higher notes on the offbeats in between. And that may seem counterintuitive, but this is also how the pattern starts. When the synth moves to its normal tone and register after the pickup, it does so on this F sharp. Plus, and this is maybe cheating, but the stems for the song include a count-off that was cut from the final recording, and that also indicates that they were treating this as beat 1. So great, that's beat 1. We're done. Right? Not quite. It turns out this is still wrong. If you listen to the transition again, you'll probably notice that the tempo slows down, or at least that's how I'd always thought about it. Later in the song, though, they bring the pattern back, accompanied by a full drum groove, and yeah, so turns out these were triplets all along. I'd been hearing them in groups of 2, but they were supposed to be in groups of 3 to align with the song's shuffle groove. When I listen to it with these drums, the phrasing is clear as day, so why is it so hard to hear that in the intro? I mean, it is hard to hear it that way, right? This isn't just me, because I'm kinda losing my mind over this. How did they trick me into hearing this completely wrong for decades? Well, probably the biggest factor here is the dynamics, or more precisely, the lack thereof. This line is played on a Yamaha DX7, which is touch sensitive, but I guess they sequenced the part without changing the velocity settings because the volumes of all the notes sound identical to me. Without any dynamic accents, we're forced to find our metric information elsewhere, and since there's no rhythmic variation either, all we're left with is pitch. Higher notes carry more energy, so absent any other clues, they seem like the most natural beats. If I turn up the volume on the intended accents, it becomes a lot easier to hear those groups of 3. All I needed was a little dynamic information in order to properly orient myself, but the riff doesn't give me any. Now, one possible explanation is that this was a mistake. The DX7 was new technology at the time, and it was notoriously hard to work with, so maybe they just got so used to thinking about it one way that they didn't realize it wouldn't come across to the listener. But I don't think that's the case, because it's not just the dynamics. The main percussive element in the section is a hi-hat, which sounds like a constant timekeeper, but is actually also positioned on those offbeats, again tricking you into hearing them as beats. And then there's the guitar, which starts like this, with a slide that not only obscures the transition in the synth, but seems to begin on that same incorrect downbeat. There's also some cues that point toward the correct phrasing, but they're less obvious, at least to my ears. So no, I don't think this was a mistake. I think this section is intentionally rhythmically disorienting, lulling you into a false pattern in order to build a sense of urgency that turns to confusion when the actual pulse is revealed. It's musical misdirection, knocking you off balance right as the song begins. As we settle into the groove, they introduce us to the verse progression. On its own, you might assume we were in the key of G. After all, we keep resolving to that chord and then hanging on it for a long time. Classic one-chord behavior. And if this was all we heard, that'd probably be correct, but I left out one important part. The bass. Yeah, it just keeps doing that. It stays on D for the entire section under all the chords, and that insistent repetition in the lowest voice makes it pretty hard for me to hear anything else as the root. It sounds like it wants to do this, which would make it a classic blues cadence, but it keeps getting stuck on the 4 chord and then just starting over without returning home. And that's gonna be a theme in this song. The bass makes it pretty clear where the root is, but it's gonna be a long time before anyone else acknowledges it. After a couple repetitions, we settle into the actual verse, and while the chords here are the same, the sound of the synth has changed. Or, more precisely, one of the layers has been removed. In order to achieve the song's iconic timbre, Tears for Fears used MIDI sequencing devices to play a couple different synth sounds on top of each other. The first of these is the Prophet T8, an analog synth playing a patch that's designed to emulate a guitar tone. The other is the Yamaha DX7, a digital synth emulating a piano. Before the vocals come in, they play both, and all the higher overtones of the T8 give it a bright, spiky tone. For the actual verse, though, the T8 drops out, leaving just the softer, warmer tone of the DX7. It's still a synth, and it's still playing the exact same notes, but the shift from this to this mellows out the music to avoid getting in the way of the melody. That brings us to the vocals. Welcome to your life. And the main thing I want to talk about is Kurt Smith's unique vocal style. These days, I'm a music theorist, but I actually spent most of my time in college training to be a vocal instructor, so with that in mind, I'd like to talk a little bit about what exactly he's doing here. If I had to quickly describe what makes Smith's voice special, I'd say that it sounds like he's yawning while he's singing, and that's down to a couple factors. First, he's extremely relaxed. His throat is open, there's no tension, and not a lot of pressure either. He's loose, but not so loose that it starts to get breathy, so from a technique standpoint, he's well set up to have a beautifully full, well-rounded tone. But the thing that really catches my attention here is his approach to registration. Generally, in this range, you'd expect a singer like Smith to employ some kind of mixed voice, blending in some mask resonance to create a lighter, brighter tone like Rivers Cuomo does in the Weezer cover. But Smith doesn't do that. Instead, he tries to drag his chest voice up way higher than it wants to go, giving his voice a darker, heavier quality that sounds like it's stuck in the back of his throat. And the reason this isn't what we're trained to do is that it really messes with your intonation. As you go higher, staying in a pure chest voice puts more and more weight on your voice, and that weight will inevitably drag you flat. When he jumps up to that F sharp, welcome to, it's not even close. He has to slide in from the E below it, and even then he doesn't make it all the way up. Throughout the song, this note is pretty hit or miss for him, and even on the lower ones, he tends to waver around the notes instead of hitting them dead on. But as I mentioned in my video on analyzing the voice, it's important to remember that loose intonation isn't the same thing as bad intonation. There's plenty of reasons that a less technically precise singer might sound better in a given song. In this case, I think it's worth remembering the historical context. Tears for Fears rose to prominence at the dawn of the age of digital synthesis, when synthesizer technology was finally becoming affordable enough that average people could buy their own. At a pretty fundamental level, this changed what it meant to be a musician. With programmable instruments and endlessly customizable timbres, making the music you wanted to make was no longer about physical technique, it was about creative problem solving. It was, in some strange way, a kind of folk tradition, leveling the playing field and opening the doors for people with different backgrounds, experiences, and skill sets to come in and invent new kinds of music. This followed followed the new wave movement of the late 70s, where bands like Talking Heads and the B-52s had already been pushing the boundaries of what a pop vocalist was allowed to sound like, and synthpop followed that lead, placing less emphasis on technical perfection and more on uniqueness and character. In that environment, the slight fluctuations in Smith's pitch were more than offset by a tone that made it very clear who you were listening to. Interestingly, Smith and Orzabal shared lead vocal duties depending on the song, but both of them adopted fairly similar registration techniques, so that no matter who was singing, it still sounded like Tears for Fears. Another reason this is so important here is that, like, Smith's voice is pretty much the only natural sound in the song. Orzabal has a guitar line, but beyond that, everything else is programmed and synthesized, giving it this hollow, artificial sense of precision. A perfectly technical voice on top of that would make the whole thing sound sterile and anodyne, but Smith's distinctive, unpolished approach gives us something raw, something human that we can latch onto. Without it, they'd sound like Daft Punk, and while I love Daft Punk, that's not the vibe they're going for here. The synthpop movement was very DIY, but you can't really hear that in the instruments, so you need a voice that doesn't sound perfectly professional. That leads us into the chorus, or at least it leads us into what I'm gonna call the chorus, but honestly it kinda sounds like just a continuation of the verse, and I think that's down to the vocals. Lyrically, the transition happens mid-sentence, and the melody doesn't change much either. The verse is built around this big leap from B to F sharp and back again. Welcome to your life. And the chorus starts off doing the exact same thing. Acting on your best behavior. The only real change is that they move the F sharp forward a beat, lining it up with the snare to give it a bit more punch. Or okay, the phrasing also changes slightly. In the verse he's mostly singing quarter notes, but with this little eighth note slide at the end, and a long gap between phrases. In the chorus though, that eighth note and those gaps are both gone. He becomes a straight up metronome, hitting every beat for the entire section. To my ears, this new rhythm sounds like a march, evoking the militaristic themes of the song in a subtle yet powerful way. In the second half of the chorus, that marching sound is amplified as he starts to fill in some of the space in that jumping figure. He still leaps up, but instead of falling back down, he walks down the pentatonic scale, first landing on A, and then finally giving us one of our few resolutions to our actual root, D. Everybody wants to rule the world. This expanded melodic structure, combined with a rigid, uncompromising meter, really highlights the descending shape of the line. To my ears, it evokes the idea of a race to the bottom, a harsh criticism of the philosophy of military domination described in the lyrics, and that message is driven home further by Smith's sarcastic delivery. Underneath the vocals, though, a lot of things change. The synths take a back seat, mostly just doubling the vocal line. Instead, the primary harmonic sound here is Orzabal's guitar, which is, again, basically the only natural sound besides Smith's voice. The song does a great job juxtaposing the aggressive rock sound of the guitar with the more neutral tones of the synth, and sections like this where the guitar comes to the forefront take on this darker, heavier quality that's amplified by its absence in the verse. As for chords, we're finally seeing some real motion. This starts out slow, with the chords changing once per bar, but under the last line, the harmonic rhythm picks up, changing twice per bar. And look, I could talk about chord functions here, but I think it's pretty obvious that's not what's happening. This is all about the melodic character of the harmony, with each chord moving by step to the next one. We start on E minor, the 2 chord, walk tentatively up to G, the 4, then turn around and slink back down. Instead of continuing down to D though, we turn around again and walk back up, more confidently this time, and make it all the way to A, the 5 chord. We expect this to create a big resolution to D in order to match the melody, but instead, yeah, no. Remember, no one's actually gonna play the 1 chord. The 1 chord represents rest and completion, contradicting the endless ambition of the lyrics, so even when the melody makes its way home, the chords can't follow. Going home is giving up, and we can't give up. We don't rule the world yet. From there, we get another verse-chorus cycle with some extra synth parts tossed in to keep things interesting, and then we move to the bridge. And hey, would you look at that? It's a D chord. We finally got a D chord. We played the 1 chord of the key the song is in, which doesn't seem like it'd be that noteworthy, but here we are. We've finally resolved home. except this doesn't really feel right, does it? I mean, no, we haven't changed keys, this is still the 1 chord, but it's buried in the middle of the progression. Metrically, we're clearly accenting the G chord, and while the melody is still D major pentatonic, there's a room where the light won't find you. It's not emphasizing the D, it keeps resolving back to B like it did in the verse, so it almost looks more like B minor pentatonic instead. I mean, they're the same notes either way, but it definitely doesn't sound like Smith is all that interested in the major root. So yes, we've got the 1 chord finally, but it's not the big event you'd expect it to be. If the lack of 1 chord in the rest of the song symbolizes endless ambition and a desire to rule the world, this is Alexander weeping for there were no more worlds to conquer. This section also features Orzabal's guitar at its loudest and most distorted, marking this as the climax of the song, which means now we have to talk about song form. This bridge starts about a minute and a half into a 4-minute song, and it's the last time we're ever going to hear a completely new section. After this, we get a bunch of choruses with different lyrics, a couple solos over the verse progression, and an extended reprise of the intro riff, but that's it. It's all remixes. We never even get this bridge again, although underneath the intro pattern the bass plays this, which is the same root motion, so at least it's kinda there. Still though, this is weird, right? Typically the bridge comes near the end of the song to break up the monotony, but here they place it pretty early and then just start playing around with the sections they already have. And that's honestly pretty typical of Tears for Fears. Let's look at the other singles off Songs from the Big Chair. Shout's last new section is a short breakdown that comes about 2 minutes into the 4-minute single version, and while Head Over Heels does have a fairly late bridge, it's just adding vocals over the intro. Mother's Talk is the only one with a brand new section near the end, and even then it doesn't really resemble a traditional bridge. I think this speaks to a different kind of songwriting than rock musicians like me are used to, one whose structure is built less from sections and more from layers. For the rest of the song, they'll be taking things we've already heard and combining them in new ways, adding extra parts where appropriate and letting your familiarity with the basic patterns guide you through the more experimental portions. Like I said, there's a reprise of the intro, but here's the intro, and here's the reprise. As I mentioned, the addition of the full drum beat fundamentally changes the rhythmic feel, and the addition of the bass adds a sense of progressive harmony that wasn't there before. So yeah, in some sense, sure, it's the same section, but in another arguably more important sense, it's not. It has its own character, its own purpose, and it adds new elements that keep it fresh even as some parts repeat. In my experience, this layer-based approach to songwriting tends to be associated with more electronic styles. In a rock band, you only have so many people to play the parts, but you can always program up another synth line. I don't have time to go through every new layer individually, but before we wrap things up, there is one part that I do want to highlight because I think it's important. Halfway through the intro reprise, they introduce a choir synth playing a brand new melody. This line is extremely slow compared to the driving triplets underneath it, and unlike pretty much everything else we've heard so far, it resolves to D not once, but repeatedly. It even starts on D as well. This is the most D-centric part in the entire song. Over all the chaotic ambition of the riff, it presents a simple, relaxed counterpoint as if to suggest that another path exists. It's a calming influence, a symbol of hope to tie the song's message together. From there we get some solos, a bunch of choruses, and then the song fades out over the verse progression without ever really going back to 1 again. Sometimes this sort of missing resolution can imply a sense of hopelessness, but here, I'm not getting that. The song is about the cycle of violence and domination, but it doesn't view that cycle as inevitable. It just doesn't pretend we've already broken it. This hanging tension doesn't represent defeat. It's a call to action, an acknowledgement that there's still more work to be done, and nearly 40 years later, that's still true. And that's pretty much it, but before we go, I wanted to quickly acknowledge something. While I was researching this, I found that Rick Beato had also made a video about the same song, like, a month ago. I didn't realize that when I chose it, and as of this recording, I haven't watched Rick's video. I like to do my own analysis before checking out anyone else's in order to make sure that what I'm presenting is in fact my own analysis. But if you'd like another perspective on this song, I'll put a link to Rick's video in the description. And hey, thanks for watching, thanks to our Patreon patrons for making these videos possible, and extra special thanks to our featured patrons, Susan Jones, Jill Sundgaard, Duck, Howard Levine, Warren Huart, Kevin Wilamowski, and Grant Aldonas. If you want to help out and help us pick the next song we analyze too, there's a link to our Patreon on screen now. Oh, and don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.